If you watched my first video on Portal 1, you'd know that I said that that was one of my favorite puzzle games of all time, so I decided to play Portal 2 right after it, because I knew their stories were connected and I wanted to see why people love this franchise so much. Upon starting the game, you're greeted by a menu screen which has a bunch of cool things in it, like a bunch of short films, and a comic that helps tie up the backstory of the first game, as well as giving some background to the character Doug Ratman and why Aperture Labs wants to do tests in the first place. One of the short films introduces the two new robot characters for co-op mode who are named Atlas and Peabody, and it explains why they're doing tests on robots instead of humans. The opening scene of the game has a really funny tutorial section where Wheatley the robot will guide you on how to do things like move and jump, and then he'll trick you by saying things like press spacebar to speak, but it obviously just makes you jump because this is a video game.
You just jumped, but never mind, say apple. Apple. Okay, you know what, that's close enough, just hold tight.
And overall, the comedy is really well done, and it's mainly performed by Wheatley, at least at the beginning of the game, because he's your primary narrator.
Going on 3 just gives you too much time to think about it. Let's go on 1 this time. Okay, ready? 1. Catch me, catch now! I am not dead! I'm not dead!
The first few tests in the game are really similar to Portal 1, but that's not a bad thing because it helped get me back up to speed and refresh me on some of the mechanics, and it also teaches new players how the game works. The lab is also way more destroyed compared to the first game, and that's just because you've been asleep for 100 years, so the lab is just decaying since no one's there to maintain it and it's no longer active. Eventually, after solving the first few puzzles, you get reintroduced to GLaDOS after you wake her up, and she's hilarious to me. Her humor is super sarcastic, and she's even more sarcastic in this game compared to the first game, which I love since sarcasm is my primary form of humor.
Well done. Here come the test results. You are a horrible person. That's what it says, a horrible person. We weren't even testing for that.
And GLaDOS also contrasts really nicely with Wheatley because GLaDOS is super sarcastic and Wheatley has way more like in-your-face humor, which helps balance GLaDOS out, especially because he doesn't understand GLaDOS' sarcasm, so he often references what GLaDOS says but doesn't understand that it's sarcasm, so it just makes for really funny moments.
Alright, fatty, adopted, fatty, no parents. What?
What exactly is wrong with being adopted?
What's wrong with being adopted? Lack of parents.
For the record, you are adopted and that's terrible.
Because you killed GLaDOS in the first game and she's had 100 years to think about it, she's super salty and is always coming up with ways to try and get revenge on you, so it makes for some really good insults since she's had so long to think about what to say to you.
Remember before when I was talking about smelly garbage standing around being useless? That was a metaphor. I was actually talking about you. And I'm sorry. You didn't react at the time, so I was worried it sailed right over your head.
The puzzles in Portal 2 are definitely ramped up from the first game, at least after the first few starter puzzles, and they have a much bigger focus on momentum, and they actually replaced a few of the items with other items, like they got rid of the orbs and replaced them with lasers, which was a good design decision since you can see where the lasers are at all times instead of trying to look for a tiny slow-moving orb. After doing some levels where GLaDOS basically just insults you the whole time, she finally puts you in one where she makes you literally kill companion cubes, which really wrecked me because of how much I liked the one from the first game. And she knows you have to do it, and then insults you for it anyway, despite giving you that task. So it really just upset me.
Oh, did I accidentally fizzle that before you could complete the test? I'm sorry. Go ahead and grab another one. Oh, no. I fizzled that one too.
Come on over here. Come on over here. No, you flipped me off. Come on, coward. No. Come on. You're not an intellectual. You're a fake and a fraud.
I even took one out of the level because she said that the thing that kills it was broken, but then I spent like 10 minutes trying to figure out how to get the cube out of the level, figured it out, and then took it out of the thing, and then it killed the cube anyway because GLaDOS just likes killing companion cubes. How do I transition out of killing companion cubes? The sound design is really amazing, with the lasers and light bridge sounding amazing, giving off this like buzzing aura kind of feel, and the turrets talking is pretty hilarious too.
Hello. Oh, this is ridiculous. Oh, thank God. You saved my bacon, pal.
The sense of scale in this game is huge. Once the game opens up into more cinematic moments, Wheatley will guide you through these areas and you'll just see these rows of robots hanging on these walls, or just like rooms or walkways just broken down or bent metal, and it goes on forever. And it really helps because this game's lighting system is so good despite it being 9 years old, and the physics system is better than most AAA games that release now, probably because it's based on the Half-Life 2 engine. There are even levels later into the game that are basically just open areas, or they'll even have levels where they have multiple parts where you'll have to use like a launcher to launch over this other part of the level, solve a little puzzle over there, then launch back to kind of tie the two areas together. But in the more open areas, you're basically trying to figure out how to get out of the area, and you still have to solve a puzzle, but it's not like the traditional portal puzzle. You basically have to find like where you can shoot your orange and blue portals to travel up to another space to try to escape where you're at currently. Personally, for me, these sections kind of slowed down the pace too much, especially when I got stuck for a bit trying to figure out how to progress. Like, it still got me to think in a different way compared to the other puzzles, because you have to be more aware of your surroundings in order to escape, but it was just a little too slow compared to the rest of the game. It kinda just felt like I was looking for the right place to shoot my portal as opposed to solving an actual puzzle. There's a minor mid-game spoiler I'm about to say, so I'll just wait for all my haters to leave. About halfway into the game, you transfer Wheatley's core into GLaDOS to try and destroy GLaDOS, and then you're like, yeah, I defeated GLaDOS. And then Wheatley's like, yeah, you did, but actually, I like this power.
Do you have any idea how good this feels? I did this! Tiny little Wheatley did this!
So then he decides to just basically kill you and GLaDOS so he can take control of the lab. Once Wheatley is put in control of the lab, you go into this other section of Aperture Labs, and then you're narrated by Cave Johnson, who's the founder of Aperture Labs, and he basically has all these pre-recorded voiceovers, and they span all the way back from when he started the lab and then go up to his death, which I'll talk about later.
All right, let's get started. This first test involves something the lab boys call repulsion gel. You're not part of the control group, by the way. You get the gel. Last poor son of a gun got blue paint. All joking aside, that did happen. Broke every bone in his legs.
Once you get into the chapter with Cave Johnson narrating you play from the beginning of the lab and get to see the lab's early areas, which is super cool because it kind of gives you a history of how the lab started, and you solve puzzles with more primitive objects like a box with staples in it and just like these old looking items. And it's super cool to go back into the beginning of Aperture Labs to see how it started because it kind of gives you a full historical timeline from the beginning of the lab to the lab now where it's all decayed, so it gives you a whole period from when the lab first started and had success to now when it's all decaying and falling apart. You're also introduced to new puzzle mechanics in this section with things like the bouncy blue goo that'll just launch you into the air when you jump on it, an orange speed goo that makes you run super fast when you're running on it, and a white goo that lets you put portals where the white goo is, so you have to aim the white goo where you want and then use the portals where it lands to launch you. Because there's so many new mechanics and things that weren't in Portal 1, the puzzles are more complex and layered than the first game, so it really pushed me to figure out how to think, and I had to think through steps of the puzzles and how to solve each step as opposed to the puzzle as a whole, much more than I had to in Portal 1. I still had the feeling of getting a bit overwhelmed when I walked into a hard-looking puzzle room, but if you just take a step-by-step approach, it's way easier than you might think, even though there's a ton of new mechanics and things going on. If you just look for how each thing interacts with one other thing, it'll usually work because usually the elements only interact with one or two other things and you might have to go back. But if you just go step by step, it's easier than you might think, which is why I never had to end up looking at a walkthrough. There were one or two puzzles that I can't figure out if I cheesed or not, but even then it still made me feel smart, so I didn't really care. If you happen to get stuck on a puzzle for a long time, don't look up a walkthrough. I was stuck on this one puzzle for 30 minutes, probably, and I just gave up, and then I came back to it the next day and then figured it out in 5. So sometimes you just have to reset your mind and then retry it. Going back to the Cave Johnson section where he narrates you, he eventually narrates his whole life and kind of goes through the history of the lab, which is super cool, because you see how fixated he is on just doing science and nothing else and doesn't care about the consequences. But eventually he gets sick and dies from eating moon rocks, which isn't that surprising, but it's also hilarious.
We literally could not afford to buy $7 worth of moon rocks, much less 70 million. Bought them anyway, ground them up, mixed them into a gel. And guess what? Ground up moon rocks are pure poison. I am deathly ill.
And he decides to make Catherine, who's his assistant, the new head of the lab. And that story arc actually has a really good ending and surprise, but I don't want to spoil it here. Later on into the game, Wheatley becomes more and more desperate to kill you since he's getting corrupt on his power, and he wants to kill you and GLaDOS so he can keep running his lab experiments. So you sort of team up with GLaDOS, who's now powered by a potato. But there was this nice character arc with GLaDOS starting out as the antagonist in the game, and then Wheatley became bad and eventually corrupted with power, so their roles kind of switched, and you actually start to become not friends with GLaDOS, but you understand her motives now, and have a common enemy with Wheatley.
After seeing what he's done to my facility, after we take over again, is it alright if I kill him?
Similarly to how the characters can change, Portal 2's world also feels changeable because of the various things you can interact with outside of the test chambers, like changing out the turrets to defective ones, and then having the turrets not affect you for the rest of the game because they're defective. I'm not going to spoil the final boss fight or ending, but I'll just say that the final boss fight is better than the first game but still a bit too simplistic for me. But the story wrapped up nicely while still potentially leaving room for another game, because Wheatley does apologize at the end of the game, and it's up to the player to decide if he's forgiven or not. There's a common theme with this game and in the first Portal where the decisions you make and things that occur in the story don't necessarily have clear answers or right or wrong answers to those questions that the game is posing, so it's kinda up to the player to decide how that makes them feel or who should be redeemed or not in the game's story. I liked playing Portal 2 straight after Portal 1 because the stories are so closely tied together since GLaDOS' relationship with you is tied to the first game's ending, so it does make sense to play them in order, but you don't necessarily have to play Portal 1 and 2 in order because Portal 2 does give a whole history of Aperture Labs. So maybe if Valve kept making games, we would have Portal 3 by now, or maybe even Half-Life 3, but instead we get DLC for Left 4 Dead 2, which is an 11-year-old game. Portal 2 was a big step up in terms of production value and cinematics, but if you could play only one game, I'd play Portal 1 over Portal 2, just because the story in Portal 1 is self-contained on its own, and you don't necessarily need another game after that, but Portal 2's story was a very good follow-up, and if you just talk about it from a puzzle game standpoint, Portal 2 is the better puzzle game. But what makes this franchise so great is that the Portal gameplay and story are all tied together through mechanics and narration, so everything you do in-game feels like you're progressing the story. I'm glad I finally got to play through both of these games since I realized how good they are, and they definitely are must-plays for any puzzle enthusiast, and now I have a new franchise that's towards the top of my favorite series list. Thanks for watching, and if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe, and tell me what your favorite puzzle game is down below.